In the city of Maricopa, Arizona, with a population of about 70,000, news spreads quickly. Especially when it comes to a couple like Victoria and David Collins, they were exactly the kind of people their neighbors talked about with admiration and slight envy. Victoria had been working as a teller at First National Bank of Maricopa for 4 years. At 32, she radiated a special femininity that seemed natural and effortless. Tall, slender, with neatly styled auburn hair and a soft voice, she was a favorite among customers. Bank manager Robert Hughes often noted her punctuality and attention to detail. Victoria was never late for a minute during her entire tenure, Hughes recalls. She was an exemplary employee. Customers would line up specifically at her window. Her husband David, 35, worked as a shift foreman at Maricopa Textile, one of the city's largest employers. Short in stature, with a sturdy build, calloused hands, and piercing gray eyes, he was well respected among his colleagues. His immediate supervisor, Thomas Green, described David as a reliable and principled man. "Dave was one of those guys you could count on," Green said. "If he promised something, he always delivered. The workers respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself." The couple lived in a small 2-story house on Maple Street in an area that locals called the family neighborhood. Their house stood out for its immaculately maintained garden, which was Victoria's pride and joy. Every morning, before leaving for work, she would check on the roses and water the petunias in the hanging baskets. Neighbor Dorothy Parker, a 70-year-old retiree who lived across the street, was a frequent witness to their morning routine. They would leave the house at almost the same time, says Mrs. Parker. David usually kissed Victoria goodbye right by the car. Such a sweet couple. I always thought they had it all. In the evenings, Victoria often spent time at the Beauty and Style hair salon, which was run by her best friend, Maria Sanchez. Maria, 29, came to Maricopa 5 years ago from Los Angeles, saved up money, and started her own business. She became Victoria's first close friend in the city. Vic was special, Maria says, still using the affectionate nickname. She understood people better than anyone else. When I first opened the salon and was worried about whether it would survive, she sat with me for hours, helping me choose paint colors for the walls and pick out music. I couldn't have done it without her support. According to Maria, Victoria rarely spoke about her past before moving to Maricopa. She mentioned that she grew up in Texas, in a small town. She had virtually no family. Her parents died when she was young. I always felt that it caused her pain, so I didn't press her for details. David, on the other hand, was a local. He grew up in Maricopa, graduated from the local high school, served in the Army for several years, and then returned home. His father died of a heart attack when David was 28, and his mother moved to Florida to live with her sister. He had had several serious relationships, but none had led to marriage until he met Victoria. They met 3 years ago at the Sandstone Cafe in downtown Maricopa. Victoria had just moved to Maricopa and was looking for a job, and David often stopped by for lunch between shifts. According to his colleagues, he was immediately struck by her refinement and gentleness. "Dave was like a teenager," laughs his factory colleague Mike Robinson. "He talked about the girl from the cafe for a month until he finally worked up the courage to ask her out on a date. A year later, they were married. I've never seen him so happy." Their wedding was modest, a small ceremony at City Hall, followed by dinner at the Desert Oasis restaurant with 24 close friends and colleagues. Victoria wore a simple white dress she bought at a local store, and David wore the only suit he owned. Maria was her maid of honor, and Mike Robinson was the groom's best man. "It was one of the most beautiful weddings I've ever seen," Maria recalls. "Not because of the luxury, but because of the way they looked at each other. There was something special in their eyes." During their 2 years of marriage, the Collinzas seemed like a model middle-class couple. David worked extra shifts to save up for a new house in a more prestigious neighborhood. Victoria dreamed of having children and often talked about it with Maria. "She wanted 2, a boy and a girl," Maria says. "We even picked out names. She was sure she would be a wonderful mother." However, behind the outward appearance of well-being lay small but disturbing details that would later become important. Dr. James Wilson, a family doctor with 30 years of experience who served half the city, noted that Victoria always came to appointments alone, even when it came to family planning. Usually young couples come together to discuss such issues, Dr. Wilson notes. But Victoria was always alone. When I asked about her husband, she said he was very busy at work. Maria also noticed some oddities in her friend's behavior. Sometimes Vic would become very withdrawn when the conversation turned to childhood or family. She would change the subject or find an excuse to leave. I thought it was because of the trauma of losing her parents. David, for his part, increasingly expressed impatience about the lack of children in the family. His colleagues at the factory noticed that he had become more irritable, especially when one of them talked about their children. Dave has changed in recent months, admits Mike Robinson. He became more withdrawn and smiled less. When I asked if everything was okay at home, he would give one-word answers and change the subject. The story of how they met, which David loved to tell his friends, began on a rainy October morning in 2021. Victoria had just arrived in Maricopa in an old 2015 Honda Civic loaded with all her belongings. She stayed at the Desert Traveler Motel on the outskirts of town, the only place she could afford. I remember that day, says motel owner Frank Diaz. She arrived around noon, soaked from the rain. She paid for a week in advance with cash and asked if there was a place nearby where she could grab a bite to eat and look for work. I sent her to Sandstone. The Sandstone Cafe was located in the heart of Maricopa, in an old brick building that had once been a bank. Owner Rose McLeod had turned it into a cozy, homey place that served simple but delicious food. It was a place where locals discussed the news, made small deals, and got to know each other. I noticed her right away, Rose recalls. She was soaked to the bone, but she held herself with dignity. She only ordered coffee and toast, even though she was clearly hungry. When I brought her order, she asked if I needed any help. There was something in her voice, a kind of desperate hope. David came to the cafe around noon, as usual during his lunch break. He worked the morning shift and always ordered the same thing, a burger with fries and a Coke. Rose seated Victoria at a table next to where David usually sat. They didn't talk on that first day, Rose continues, but I saw Dave stealing glances at her. And she pretended to read the newspaper, but she was watching him too. It was such a classic situation. Victoria returned to the cafe the next day and the day after that. Rose offered her a temporary job helping in the kitchen and waiting tables during the lunch rush. The pay was modest, but it was enough for a motel room and simple meals. She was very hardworking, Rose notes. She never complained, even when she had to work late. And the customers loved her. She had a gift. She knew how to listen to people. David continued to come in for lunch every day. Mike Robinson, his best friend and co-worker at the factory, often kept him company. Dave was spellbound, Mike laughs. He started dressing more neatly, shaving every day, even bought a new shirt. But he was afraid to talk to her. I egged him on, telling him that someone else would snatch her up. The first conversation between David and Victoria took place 2 weeks after her arrival. Rose specifically asked Victoria to bring him his order. She approached the table with trembling hands, Rose recalls, and he blushed like a schoolboy. But something happened between them at that moment. I saw them looking into each other's eyes. David later said that he was struck by the unusual depth of her gaze. It seemed like she understood more than she showed, he told his colleagues, as if she had lived more than her years. Victoria, for her part, was charmed by his sincerity. Dave was honest, she told Maria many months later. There was no pretense about him. He said what he thought, and he thought what he said. Their first date took place over the weekend. David invited her to the local Star Plaza movie theater to see No Time to Die, the latest James Bond film. After the movie, They walked through Maricopa's Central Park, talking late into the night. "I walked her back to her motel," David told his friends. "We talked about everything, movies, music, dreams. She wanted to travel, to see the world, and I told her about Maricopa, about the people here." However, even then, Victoria's personality traits, which would later become a source of questions, were already apparent. When David asked her about her past, she responded evasively. She said she grew up in a small town in Texas, David recalls in a later conversation with Detective Sarah Miller. She gave different names for the town, sometimes Lafkin, sometimes Tyler. When I pointed this out, she laughed and said her family moved around a lot. Rose McLeod also noticed strange behavior in Victoria. She never received any letters or phone calls. Not from family or friends. That was unusual for a girl her age. When I asked her about it, she said she preferred to start her life with a clean slate. A month after they met, Victoria got a job at a bank. Manager Robert Hughes needed a new teller after the previous employee went on maternity leave. Victoria made a good impression on him during the interview. She had all the necessary documents, Hughes notes. Birth certificate, social security number, criminal record check. Everything was in order. The only thing that seemed strange was that she had no work history for her age. When Hughes asked about this, Victoria explained that she had been caring for her sick mother for the past few years and had been unable to work officially. It sounded plausible, he says, and the references from her previous employers were positive. With a new job and a steady income, Victoria moved from a motel to a small apartment on 2nd Avenue. David helped her move and buy furniture. Their relationship developed rapidly. They spent every weekend together, says Mike Robinson. Dave was head over heels in love. He said he had finally met the woman of his dreams. But even during the honeymoon period of their relationship, there were some peculiarities that surprised those around them. Victoria categorically refused any plans involving trips to Texas. Dave suggested visiting her relatives for the holidays, Mike recalls, but she always found excuses. She said she wasn't ready yet, that she needed more time. Maria Sanchez, who met Victoria a few months after she arrived in Maricopa, also noticed something strange. Vic never talked about her childhood, Maria says. Most women like to reminisce about their school years, their first love, their girlfriends. But when the conversation turned to that, she always changed the subject. Maria found Victoria's attitude toward photographs particularly strange. She didn't have a single childhood or school photo. When I asked her about it, she said that everything had been destroyed in a fire at her parents' house. After a year of dating, David proposed. It happened in the same park where they had walked after their first date. Victoria said yes, but asked for time to prepare for the wedding. She wanted to do everything right, David recalls. Find the right dress, choose a venue for the ceremony. I didn't rush her. However, the wedding preparations revealed new oddities in Victoria's behavior. She insisted that the ceremony be as modest as possible, without inviting relatives. I offered to pay for her relatives to travel from Texas, David says. But she said they were having financial difficulties and wouldn't be able to come. I thought that was strange, but I didn't insist. Dr. James Wilson, who became Victoria's family doctor after she moved to Maricopa, notes another peculiarity. On her first visit, she brought her medical records from the clinic in Austin, but the records only covered the last 2 years. Usually people bring their entire medical history, Dr. Wilson explains, especially if they have chronic conditions or allergies. But Victoria only had a short-term history. When he inquired about earlier records, Victoria explained that her previous doctor had retired and closed his practice, and the archives had been lost. After the wedding, the newlyweds bought a house on Maple Street. David took out a loan, using his seniority at the factory as collateral. Victoria contributed her savings as a down payment. She was very practical about financial matters, notes bank manager Hughes. She always kept accurate records of her expenses and set aside a certain amount each month. It's rare to find such discipline in young people. The first year of marriage was relatively peaceful. David and Victoria settled into family life. He worked at the factory, she worked at the bank, and they spent their evenings at home or with friends. However, by the end of the first year of marriage, David began to show impatience about starting a family. He wanted children, says Mike Robinson. He said he wasn't getting any younger and wanted to be a young father. Every time the conversation turned to children, Victoria asked him to wait a little longer. She said she wanted to get a better job first, to save more money, recalls Maria Sanchez. But I could see that talking about pregnancy upset her. The Collins' second year of marriage began with growing tension. David brought up the subject of children more and more often, and Victoria found new reasons to postpone. These conversations took place mainly at home, behind closed doors, but neighbors sometimes heard raised voices. They had frequent arguments in the last few months, says Dorothy Parker, a neighbor across the street. Usually late at night. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clearly confrontational. And in the morning, they would leave the house pretending everything was fine. The situation became more complicated when, in February 2024, David's best friend Mike Robinson announced that his wife was pregnant with their second child. This became a painful topic for David. Dave congratulated us, of course, Mike recalls, but I could see how it affected him. He became more withdrawn and worked overtime more often, and when I tried to talk to him, he brushed me off. David's co-workers at the factory also noticed changes in his behavior. Tom Green, his immediate supervisor, noted that David had become more abrupt with his subordinates. He was always demanding, but fair, Green says. But at the beginning of this year, something changed. He became impatient, sometimes snapping at workers over minor issues. When I asked if everything was okay at home, he said he was just tired. Victoria, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly anxious. Maria Sanchez noticed that her friend often came to the salon in a nervous state. She became distracted, Maria says. She would come in for a haircut and then remember that she had already had her haircut a week ago. Or she would sit in the chair, and I could see that she was thinking hard about something. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she was just tired from work. The bank also began to notice changes in Victoria's behavior. Robert Hughes, her manager, received a complaint from a customer about her inattentiveness for the first time in her entire career. An elderly man came in to withdraw money, Hughes says. Victoria mixed up the amounts and gave him $200 more than he asked for. Fortunately, he was honest and returned the money, but that wasn't like her at all. The turning point came one evening in March, when David came home earlier than usual. Victoria was in the shower, and on the kitchen table lay a printout of the results of medical tests she had taken as part of her annual checkup. David accidentally saw the title of the document and became interested. He thought it strange that his wife hadn't told him about her visit to the doctor. He wanted to move the papers aside to make room for dinner, but his attention was drawn to unfamiliar medical terms. "He's not a doctor," Wilson later explained to Detective Miller. "But some of the terms in the tests can be of interest to anyone, especially when it comes to hormone levels that seem unusual." When Victoria came out of the bathroom, she found David holding her medical records. His face was pale, and his eyes showed surprise and confusion. "Vic, what does this mean?" he asked, pointing to the lines in the test results. Victoria tried to explain that these were routine tests, and that all the indicators were normal. But David was already in the mood for a serious conversation. He asked questions about specific values and why she hadn't told him about her visit to the doctor. "It seemed to me that he suspected something specific," Maria later recounted, whom Victoria had called in tears that same evening. She said that David was asking strange questions, but she didn't explain what they were. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Collins home became even more tense. David began to show an increased interest in medical issues. He visited an internet cafe in the city center several times to search for something online. Dave wasn't particularly computer savvy, says internet cafe owner Steve Connor. But in March, he came in several times and asked for help finding information about medical tests. He said he wanted to better understand his wife's health. At the same time, David began to notice details in Victoria's behavior and appearance that had previously seemed natural to him. Her reluctance to wear revealing clothing, her preference for modest swimsuits during rare trips to the lake, the peculiarities of her voice in the early morning. Mike Robinson noticed that David started asking strange questions about women and marriage. He asked if it was possible to think you knew someone and then find out that you didn't know anything about them at all, Mike recalls. I thought he was talking about some kind of financial secret or maybe an ex-boyfriend. The situation came to a head in early April when David decided to surprise Victoria and made an appointment with Dr. Wilson to discuss family planning. He wanted to show his wife that he was serious about fatherhood. Dr. Wilson found himself in a difficult situation. On the one hand, he was bound by medical confidentiality, but on the other, he understood that the husband had a right to know information concerning their shared future. I tried to explain to him that Victoria needed to discuss certain medical issues with him herself, says Dr. Wilson, but he insisted. He said that she had been putting off talking about children for several months, and he was beginning to worry that she had serious health problems. The conversation with the doctor did not clarify the situation for David, but made him even more suspicious that his wife was hiding something from him. Dr. Wilson was clearly uncomfortable, evading direct answers and repeating that Victoria should explain everything herself. That same day, when he got home, David tried to talk to his wife about the doctor's visit. Victoria was furious that her husband had gone to Dr. Wilson without her knowledge. It was their first serious fight, says Dorothy Parker. I heard them yelling at each other. She was saying something about trust and personal boundaries, and he was demanding honesty. After this argument, Victoria became even more withdrawn. She often stayed late at work, spent more time at Maria's salon, and avoided being alone with her husband. She was like a hunted animal, Maria recalls. I offered to let her stay with me for a few days, until they both calmed down. But she said it would only make the situation worse. David, in turn, became more persistent in his attempts to find out the truth. He began looking through his wife's personal belongings while she was at work. He was looking for something that could explain her strange behavior and medical peculiarities. Dave became paranoid, notes Mike Robinson. He said he felt like a fool for marrying someone he didn't know at all. I tried to calm him down, telling him that everyone has secrets, but he wouldn't listen. The climax came on Saturday, April 20th. Victoria went to Maria's for the whole day. They were planning to redecorate the living room. David stayed home alone and decided to get to the bottom of the situation. He began a systematic search of the house. He checked all the drawers, shelves, and closets. In the bedroom, in the far corner of the closet, behind the winter clothes, he found a small box he had never seen before. The box contained documents that Victoria had carefully hidden, medical records from a clinic in Austin dated several years earlier, old documents with a name that was not Victoria, photographs in which she looked completely different. David sat on the bedroom floor, holding documents that completely overturned his understanding of who his wife was. Records of hormone therapy, documents about an official name change, certificates from specialized clinics. All of this painted a picture he could not even imagine. When Victoria returned home a few hours later, she found David sitting at the kitchen table. All the documents he had found were laid out in front of him, neatly arranged in chronological order. Their eyes met, and Victoria immediately understood that the secret had been revealed. There was no anger on David's face, only confusion, shock, and deep incomprehension. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, and in those two words was all the pain of a man who realized that the last 3 years of his life had been based on a lie. Victoria tried to explain, to tell him about her past, about the difficult path to becoming herself. She talked about how she had always felt like a woman, about the years of struggle and transformation, about how moving to Maricopa was an attempt to start a new life. But David wasn't listening. He looked at the documents, then at her, and something cold and alien grew in his eyes. The man who had been her loving husband that morning was turning into a stranger. "You've been deceiving me all this time," he said, and there were notes in his voice that Victoria had never heard before. "We got married. I thought, God, what will people say?" The conversation continued late into the night. Victoria cried, begged for understanding, explained that she was the same woman he had fallen in love with. David was silent, periodically getting up and pacing the room like a caged animal. By Sunday morning, it was clear that their marriage was falling apart. David couldn't accept what he had learned. For him, it wasn't just a matter of hiding the past. It was a complete deception of his perception of reality. "I don't know who you are," he repeated. "The person I married doesn't exist." Monday, April 22nd, began with a deceptive calm on Maple Street. Dorothy Parker got up at 6 a.m. as usual to water the flowers in her garden. She noticed that the Collinses had their lights on, which was unusual for that time of day. They usually left the house around 7, Mrs. Parker later told Detective Miller. But something was wrong that morning. The lights had been on all night, and the curtains were drawn. The atmosphere in the Collinses' house was heavy. David had been up all night, sitting in the living room, periodically sorting through the documents he had found. Victoria couldn't sleep either. She lay in the bedroom, sobbing occasionally. Around 7 in the morning, Victoria went down to the kitchen. She was pale, her eyes red from crying. David was still sitting at the table, staring at one spot. "Dave, we need to talk," she said quietly. "We can't leave it like this." He slowly raised his head. There was nothing of yesterday's confusion in his gaze, only cold determination. "Talk?" he repeated. "About what? About how you lied to me for 3 years? About how our marriage is a farce?" Victoria tried to approach him, but he stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. "Don't come near me. I don't know who you are." "I'm the same Victoria you fell in love with," she said imploringly. "Nothing has changed about who I am." "Everything has changed," David exploded. "You're a man. You're disgusting." The words hurt Victoria more deeply than the physical pain. She saw the man she loved turn into a stranger, full of hatred. "Dave, please try to understand," she began. "Understand what? That you're a pervert? What have you done to me, God? What am I going to tell people? Mike? Everyone at work?" David began pacing around the kitchen, his movements becoming more and more erratic. "They'll laugh at me. They'll say I'm an idiot who couldn't figure out who he was sleeping with." Victoria stood in the doorway, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. David was in a state she had never seen him in before, almost uncontrollable rage mixed with disgust. "We can go our separate ways," she suggested, quietly, without a scandal. "I'll leave town. No one will know." "What about my feelings?" David interrupted her. "What about what you did to me? You think you can just leave, as if nothing happened?" He approached her, and for the first time since they had met, Victoria felt fear. There was such rage in her husband's eyes that it frightened her. "Dave, you're scaring me," she whispered. "I scare you?" He laughed bitterly. "Do you know what scares me? Who I slept with. What was that? What kind of perversion was that?" Victoria backed away toward the stairs. "I'll go pack my things. I'll leave today." But when she turned to go upstairs, something in David finally snapped. All the emotions that had built up over the night, anger, betrayal, humiliation, came pouring out in one burst. The last thing Victoria saw was the face of the man she loved, contorted with rage and disgust. Dorothy Parker noticed that David's car was still parked in the driveway at 8:30 in the morning. It was strange. He was never late for work. "I thought he might be sick," she said later. "I wanted to cross the street and see if he needed any help." At 9:30, she saw David come out of the house. His movements seemed mechanical, his face pale. He got into his car and drove away without even looking in her direction. Something about his appearance alarmed me, Mrs. Parker continued. He looked lost, as if he didn't understand where he was. Around 11 in the morning, Dorothy noticed that the front door of the Collins' house was ajar. This was completely unlike the meticulous Victoria, who always locked the house carefully. Concerned, Mrs. Parker crossed the street and rang the doorbell. No one answered. She peeked through the open door and called out to Victoria. "Vic, is everything okay?" Silence. Dorothy cautiously entered the house. Everything looked normal in the living room, but in the kitchen, the elderly woman saw something that made her scream and run out of the house, dialing 911 with trembling hands. Detective Sarah Miller received the call at 11:47 a.m. A 44-year-old woman with 20 years of experience in the police force, she had seen a lot, but murders in Maricopa were extremely rare. Suspected homicide at 247 Maple Street, the dispatcher reported. The victim is a woman in her 30s. Miller arrived at the scene 20 minutes later. The house was already cordoned off with yellow tape, and neighbors had gathered at a safe distance. Dorothy Parker sat in the patrol car, still in shock. "What do we have?" Miller asked Sergeant Tom Davis, who was the first to respond to the call. "Victoria Collins, 32 years old, found in the kitchen around noon. A neighbor discovered the body. The front door was open. Miller entered the house, wearing protective gloves. The crime scene told a sad story. There were signs of a struggle in the kitchen, overturned chairs, broken dishes. Victoria was lying by the back door, apparently trying to run out of the house. Preliminary findings indicate blunt force trauma to the head," said Coroner Jack Williams, who arrived shortly thereafter. "Possibly multiple blows. Time of death is approximately between 7 and 9 in the morning." Miller carefully examined the scene. Medical documents lay neatly arranged on the kitchen table. This struck her as odd. Usually during a quarrel, papers are scattered, not neatly arranged. "Where's the husband?" she asked Davis. "David Collins. He works at the textile factory. We contacted his boss. He came to work this morning but left around 10, saying he wasn't feeling well." Miller photographed the documents on the table without moving them. Medical certificates, records of hormone therapy, documents about a name change. The picture was beginning to become clearer. "We need to find her husband," she said, "and interview all the neighbors." Someone might have seen or heard something. She decided to talk to Dorothy Parker first. The elderly woman was still in shock, but she tried to be helpful. "They had a fight over the weekend," Mrs. Parker said. "I heard shouting. And last night their lights were on all night. Did you see David this morning?" "Yes, around 8:30. He left the house and went to work. He looked very upset." How exactly upset? Dorothy thought. Like someone who had received very bad news. Pale, lost. Miller questioned other neighbors. A sad picture emerged. A couple who seemed perfect was going through a serious crisis. Jim Carter, who lived next door, heard loud voices on Sunday evening. The man's voice sounded very angry, he said. The woman's voice sounded more pleading. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the technicians finished their initial examination of the crime scene. Miller received permission to examine the house in more detail. In the bedroom, she found signs of a hasty search. The closet was open, the clothes were moved. In the far corner, behind the winter clothes, there was an empty space. Apparently, a box of documents had been stored there, which now lay on the kitchen table. Miller checked the bathroom. Everything was neat, but she noticed that Victoria's cosmetics were expensive and carefully selected, more than a bank teller would normally buy. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, David Collins still hadn't shown up. Miller contacted the factory. He left around 10 in the morning, confirmed shift supervisor Tom Green. He said he wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He looked terrible, pale, shaky hands. Did he say anything else? Just that he had problems at home. I didn't ask any questions. Miller dispatched patrol cars to search for David's vehicle. a blue 2019 Ford pickup truck. She also requested that his mother's home in Florida and places where he might be staying in the city be checked. At 4 p.m., she decided to talk to the victim's best friend, Maria Sanchez. The hair salon owner was shocked by the news. "I can't believe Vic is dead," Maria cried. "Who could have done this?" "Tell me about her relationship with her husband." They seemed happy. But in recent months, Vic had been very tense. She said David was pressuring her about the children. Miller showed Maria photos of medical records. "Did you know about Victoria's past?" Maria nodded. "She told me a year after we met. I was the only one who knew. Vic was very afraid that people in town wouldn't understand." "Did David know?" "No. She was going to tell him, but she was afraid of his reaction. Dave is quite conservative." "When was she going to tell him?" "Probably never. She hoped she could live with this secret for the rest of her life." At 5 p.m., patrol officers found David's pickup truck in a parking lot at a shopping center on the outskirts of town. The car was locked and the keys were missing. Video cameras showed that he had left it there around noon. "He walked away in the direction of the bus station," Officer Rodriguez reported. "He may be trying to leave town." Miller immediately contacted the bus station. David had indeed purchased a bus ticket to Phoenix, which was scheduled to depart at 2:30 p.m. "Describe his condition," she asked the cashier. "Very nervous. His hands were shaking when he handed over the money. He looked back several times, as if he was afraid of someone." By 6 p.m., Miller had sent out alerts to bus stations in Arizona. David Collins was wanted on suspicion of murder. She returned to the station to file reports and prepare a plan for further investigation. The picture of the crime was fairly clear, but additional evidence was needed. "A family drama," she told Police Chief Robert Hendricks. "The husband found out about his wife's transgender past and couldn't accept it. He probably killed her in a fit of rage." Evidence? Neighbors' testimony about the quarrel. Medical records at the crime scene. The husband disappeared immediately after the murder. The time of death coincides with his presence at home. Enough for an arrest warrant? More than enough, as soon as he's found. By the end of the day, news of Victoria Collins' murder had spread throughout the city. Murders were extremely rare in Maricopa, and this shocked the residents. "She was such a nice girl," people said at the bank. "Who could have done such a thing?" But when details emerged about Victoria's transgender past and David's escape, the town's reaction was divided. Some sympathized with the victim, while others condemned her for deceiving her husband. "It's a tragedy," Mayor Gerald Thompson told local media, "but it shows the importance of honesty in relationships." The manhunt for David Collins ended 36 hours after the murder. The bus he took to leave Maricopa arrived in Phoenix on the evening of April 22nd. From there, David transferred to a night bus to Tucson, apparently hoping to disappear in the big city. He didn't think through his escape plan, Detective Miller later analyzed. He acted impulsively, under the influence of panic. He used a credit card to buy tickets, which allowed us to track his route. On the morning of April 23rd, David was spotted by surveillance cameras at the Tucson bus station. He looked exhausted, had not slept all night, and his clothes were wrinkled. Local police received a tip and began patrolling the bus station area. Officer Carlos Mendez found David around noon at the Desert Retreat, a cheap motel on the outskirts of Tucson. "He didn't resist arrest," Mendez said. "He was just sitting on the bed watching TV. When I told him he was under arrest for suspicion of murder, he just nodded." David was taken back to Maricopa that same day. Detective Miller met him at the police station. The man who 2 days ago had seemed like a simple textile factory worker now looked broken. He looked 10 years older, Miller noted. His face was gray, his hands were shaking, and he had the look of a lost man. But there was no remorse in his eyes, only confusion. The first interrogation took place in the presence of James Walker, a court-appointed lawyer. David refused to speak, repeating only, "You don't understand what she did to me." "Tell me what happened on Monday morning." Miller asked. She lied to me, David replied. 3 years of lies. I'm married, I don't even know what to call it. The lawyer tried to stop his client, but David continued to speak as if the pent-up emotions demanded an outlet. I found those papers, medical records, photographs. She was a man. Do you understand? I slept with a man. Miller carefully wrote down every word. What happened on Monday morning? We talked. I tried to understand, but I couldn't. It's unnatural, disgusting. And then? David was silent for a few minutes. When he spoke again, his voice was trembling. She said she was leaving. She'd just pack her things and leave, as if she could erase 3 years of my life, as if nothing had happened to me. David, did you hit Victoria? A long pause. I didn't mean to, She turned to go upstairs, and something inside me snapped. All those years of deception, humiliation. I grabbed a frying pan from the stove. The confession was obtained. David Collins was formally charged with second-degree murder. Maricopa County Attorney David Stern considered upgrading the charge to first-degree murder, but decided there was insufficient evidence of premeditation. This was a crime of passion, Stern explained to reporters, but that does not excuse the defendant's actions. Victoria Collins was an innocent victim of prejudice and hatred. While the formal proceedings were underway, Detective Miller continued to gather evidence to strengthen the case. She interviewed everyone who knew the Collinses, piecing together a complete picture of their relationship. Dr. James Wilson gave detailed testimony about Victoria's medical history. She was a model patient, he said. She had regular checkups and took care of her health. Her transgender transition was completed medically correctly several years before she moved to Maricopa. Why didn't she tell her husband? Miller asked. She was afraid of rejection. There is still a lot of prejudice against transgender people in our society. Victoria just wanted to live a normal life. Maria Sanchez gave emotional testimony about the last months of her friend's life. Vic was terrified that Dave would find out the truth, she cried. She said she would rather die than lose him. The bitter irony of these words was not lost on those present in the courtroom. David's colleagues from the factory described his growing aggression in recent months. Dave has always been conservative, Mike Robinson testified. He had a negative attitude toward gay people and everything like that. He said it was against nature. Tom Green, David's boss, confirmed his prejudices. There was one openly gay guy working at the factory. Dave avoided talking to him and made unpleasant comments. I had to reprimand him. This testimony helped the prosecutor build a picture of the motive. David Collins didn't just discover his wife's secret. He was confronted with a reality that contradicted his deep-seated prejudices. Public reaction to the case was mixed. Maricopa was divided into two camps. Some sympathized with Victoria as a victim of domestic violence and transphobia. Others believed that she had deceived her husband and was partly to blame for what had happened. Reverend Thomas Mills of the local Baptist church issued a statement condemning deception and perversion. Marriage is a union between a man and a woman, he preached. What this woman did was a sin against God and nature. On the other hand, a group of LGBT+ activists from Phoenix traveled to Maricopa to hold a memorial service for Victoria. She was a brave woman who just wanted to live her truth, said activist Jessica Ramirez. Her death is a reminder of how much hatred still exists in our society. Rose McLeod, the owner of the cafe where David and Victoria met, was shocked by the tragedy. I remember how they looked at each other in those early days, she told reporters. It was true love. How could it have ended so horribly? Mayor Gerald Thompson tried to appeal for calm. This is a tragedy for everyone involved, he said. We must learn tolerance and understanding so that this does not happen again. Preliminary hearings in the case began in May. David's lawyer, James Walker, tried to prove that his client was acting in a state of temporary insanity. "My client was psychologically traumatized by the discovery," Walker claimed. "He couldn't control his actions at that moment." Prosecutor Stern objected. Regardless of the defendant's emotional state, he committed premeditated murder. Victoria Collins did not deserve to die for trying to live an authentic life. The testimony of psychiatrist Dr. Rebecca Chen, who examined David after his arrest, was key. The defendant demonstrates deeply ingrained prejudices against transgender people, she told the court, but he fully understood the nature and consequences of his actions. Dr. Chen explained the psychological mechanism behind the crime. When deep-seated prejudices collide with personal reality, it can trigger an extremely aggressive reaction. The defendant perceived the discovery as a threat to his identity as a man. The main trial took place in June. The courtroom was packed. The case had attracted media attention from across the state. Judge Margaret Harris presided over the trial strictly, not allowing any emotional outbursts. The witness testimony painted a sad picture of Victoria's last days. Dorothy Parker recounted the nightly arguments. Maria Sanchez spoke about her friend's fears. Colleagues at the bank spoke about her growing anxiety. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: multiple head injuries from a blunt object, consistent with kitchen utensils. Death was almost instantaneous. When it came to David's own testimony, the courtroom fell silent. The defendant looked exhausted, but his voice was firm. "I didn't plan to kill her," he said. "But when she said she was just going to leave 3 years of my life based on a lie, everyone who knew the truth laughed at me behind my back." "No one laughed," the prosecutor objected. "Only Maria knew about Victoria's past." "But they would have found out," David insisted. "Sooner or later, everyone would have found out that I was a fool who didn't understand who he was living with." His testimony only strengthened the prosecution's case. David showed no remorse, only self-pity and continued hatred for the victim. The closing arguments were emotional. The defense attorney asked for leniency, citing his client's lack of premeditation and psychological trauma. Prosecutor Stern was relentless. Victoria Collins was killed for daring to be herself. This is not just a family tragedy. It is a hate crime that cannot go unpunished. The jury retired to deliberate on Thursday evening. The verdict was delivered on Friday morning, guilty of second-degree murder. David Collins was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. LGBT+ activists considered the punishment insufficient. The conservative part of society considered it too harsh. "Justice has prevailed," Maria Sanchez said after the sentence was announced. "But it won't bring my best friend back." After the trial, life in Maricopa slowly returned to normal. The house on Maple Street stood empty for a long time. No one wanted to buy the place where the murder had taken place. Eventually, a non-profit organization purchased it and turned it into a center for victims of domestic violence. The bank where Victoria worked established a scholarship in her name for students studying human rights. Maria Sanchez hung a photo of her friend in her salon with the inscription, "In memory of Victoria, a woman who was true to herself." Dr. Wilson became more active in educating the community about transgender people. Victoria's tragedy showed how ignorance can lead to terrible consequences, he said in public lectures. David Collins is serving his sentence in an Arizona state prison. According to prison psychologists, he still shows no remorse for his actions. He considers himself a victim of deception, Dr. Chen notes. Full rehabilitation is unlikely. The Collins case set a precedent in Arizona. It led to the adoption of stricter laws against hate crimes and the expansion of tolerance education programs. Victoria just wanted to live a normal life, Detective Miller said in an interview a year later. Her tragedy reminds us that acceptance and understanding are not luxuries, but necessities for a civilized society. The case of Victoria Collins' death is officially closed, but its impact continues to be felt in Maricopa. A city that once prided itself on its tranquility and traditional values has been forced to confront the reality of the modern world, where people must fight for the right to be themselves. In the city park where David and Victoria once walked after their first date, there is now a small memorial. A simple plaque reads, "In memory of all those who have suffered from hatred and misunderstanding. Let love conquer fear." Every year, on the anniversary of Victoria's death, a group of activists and friends gather at the memorial. They light candles, read poetry, and remind each other of the importance of acceptance and compassion. The story of Victoria and David Collins is a sad reminder of how prejudice and hatred can destroy lives. But it also shows the power of the human spirit, the ability of a community to learn from tragedy and become better.